July 24, 1944. The island of Tinian woke under a sky that did not belong to peace. The Pacific air was thick, heavy with salt and fear, and the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. For months, Japanese forces had fortified this small limestone island, turning caves into fortresses and sugarcane fields into killing zones. Nearly 9,000 Japanese soldiers were stationed here: engineers, infantrymen, pilots, labor troops, men who believed the island was not just a military post, but a final line of honor. By sunrise, American naval guns began to speak, and when they did, the earth shook like it was being torn from history itself. The bombardment did not feel like war. It felt like the end of the world. Battleships offshore fired shells so massive they erased entire ridgelines in seconds. Coral rock exploded into white dust. Trees vanished. Bunkers that took months to build disappeared in a blink. Japanese soldiers pressed their faces into the dirt, hands over their helmets, mouths open in silent screams as the sky rained steel. Communication lines were severed within hours. Command posts collapsed. Maps became useless. What had once been a carefully planned defense began to unravel before the first American boot ever touched the sand. For the Japanese command on Tinian, this was already a nightmare scenario. They had watched nearby Saipan fall weeks earlier, and they understood what that meant. Saipan's loss opened the door to the Japanese homeland itself. Tinian was next, and everyone knew it. The soldiers were told one thing only: there would be no evacuation. No reinforcements, no rescue. Victory or death were the only acceptable outcomes. Surrender was not a word that existed in their orders, nor in their minds. When American Marines landed on July 24th, they expected fierce resistance on the beaches. What they found instead was something unsettling: silence. The Japanese had pulled back deliberately, allowing the Americans to land with minimal resistance. It was not mercy. It was strategy. The real defenses were inland, hidden in caves, ravines, and underground tunnels carved into the island's soft limestone. Every step forward for the Americans would be paid for in blood. The fighting that followed was brutal, intimate, and relentless. There were no clear front lines. Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden tunnels, attacked at close range, then vanished back into the earth like ghosts. At night they crawled into American positions, throwing grenades, stabbing sleeping men, disappearing before alarms could be raised. Sleep became dangerous. Silence became terrifying. Every shadow felt alive. But the Americans kept coming. Day by day, the Japanese defensive perimeter shrank. Airfields were captured. Supply routes were cut. Water sources were destroyed or poisoned. The caves that once offered protection became death traps as flamethrowers and explosives were pushed inside. Entire units were burned alive in the darkness. The screams echoed through the rock, unheard by the outside world, unrecorded by history books. By early August, the situation for the Japanese forces was beyond desperate. Organized resistance had collapsed. Senior officers were dead or missing. Ammunition was nearly gone. Food had run out days earlier. Soldiers survived on insects, leaves, and rainwater dripping from cave ceilings. Wounded men begged to be killed to save bullets. Others carved farewell messages into cave walls, knowing no one might ever read them. And then something happened that still haunts historians. The fighting stopped. American patrols moved forward, expecting the usual resistance. Instead, they found empty positions, abandoned weapons, silent caves, no bodies, no prisoners, no signs of retreat to the sea. Nearly 9,000 Japanese soldiers were simply gone, not dead on the battlefield, not captured, not evacuated. The official declaration of victory did not bring closure. It brought confusion. As American units secured sector after sector of Tinian, their body counts remained strangely low compared to expectations. Commanders had planned for catastrophic enemy casualties, yet the numbers refused to align with reality. Patrol logs recorded hundreds killed, then thousands. But the final tallies still fell short, dangerously short. Intelligence officers rechecked maps, unit rosters, intercepted communications. Entire Japanese formations had existed on paper only days earlier. Now they had dissolved into nothing. Search operations intensified. Marines and Army engineers were ordered to locate every possible tunnel, every limestone cavity, every unnatural crack in the ground. Tinian's geology made the task nearly impossible. The island was honeycombed with natural caves, many expanded artificially over months by Japanese labor units. Some tunnels ran beneath airfields, others stretched under cliffs, surfacing near the sea. In many cases, entrances were deliberately disguised with rubble, vegetation, or collapsed from the inside. It was as if the island itself had swallowed an army. As searches went deeper, the discoveries became darker. In sealed caves, American soldiers found scenes that would never make official headlines. Skeletons still seated upright, rifles resting across their laps, grenade fragments embedded in stone walls, blackened by explosions that had consumed flesh and air alike. In some chambers, entire groups were found together, dozens of men, still arranged in formation, having died exactly where they were ordered to sit. No signs of struggle, no attempt to escape, only discipline taken to the grave. One cave revealed a particularly chilling sight. A senior officer seated slightly apart, sword still sheathed, his pistol unfired. Around him lay his men, each clutching a grenade fragment. He had not pulled a pin himself. He had watched. He had commanded. And when it was done, he had chosen a slower end. Starvation in the dark. Alone, loyal to the last breath. American psychological warfare teams had tried everything before this point. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in Japanese, promising fair treatment, medical aid, food. Leaflets were dropped showing photographs of Japanese prisoners, alive and unharmed on Saipan. None of it worked. For many on Tinian, surrender was not just unacceptable, it was unthinkable. The messages were dismissed as lies, traps, or insults. Some soldiers shot at the loudspeakers from inside caves. Others waited until nightfall and destroyed them entirely. As days passed, the island remained unsettled. Shots rang out without warning. Tripwires detonated in areas believed to be secure. Marines vanished on patrol, later found dead with knives rather than bullets used against them. These were not organized counterattacks. They were echoes, small groups of Japanese soldiers still moving, still fighting, still refusing to acknowledge reality. They lived underground, emerging only to kill or steal supplies, then retreating once more into the earth. What made Tinian different from other Pacific battles was not just the brutality, but the scale of disappearance. On Saipan, mass suicides had occurred openly, soldiers and civilians leaping. From cliffs in full view of the world, on Tinian the deaths were hidden, silent, buried. The island gave no dramatic images, no single moment to define the end. Instead, it offered a slow erasure, measured in unanswered questions and sealed stone. Japanese doctrine had prepared these men for this outcome long before the battle began. Training manuals explicitly stated that capture was betrayal. Soldiers were taught that dying without being seen was preferable to living in shame. Cave warfare was not just tactical, it was spiritual. The cave was both shield and tomb. To disappear within it was to deny the enemy victory, even in defeat. This belief was reinforced by command decisions in the final days. With communication collapsing, officers issued standing orders. If defeat was inevitable, units were to act independently, avoiding mass surrender at all costs. Survival after the battle was permissible only if it served continued resistance. Otherwise, death was duty. Many soldiers interpreted this not as a suggestion, but as law. As weeks passed, American forces began sealing caves not out of caution, but resignation. Some entrances were simply too dangerous to explore. Others were deemed not worth the cost in lives. Concrete was poured. Explosives were used to collapse entire hillsides. Warning signs were erected, then forgotten. Over time, vegetation reclaimed the scars. The island's surface healed, even as its interior remained filled with the dead. Then came the reports that refused to disappear. Months after the battle, Marines stationed on Tinian reported seeing movement at night. Supplies vanished from storage areas. Footprints appeared near wells. Occasionally, a single gunshot echoed from the jungle, followed by silence. Patrols were dispatched, but rarely found anything. When they did, it was often too late. A lone Japanese soldier, emaciated, armed, still wearing fragments of a uniform, choosing death the moment discovery became unavoidable. September 1944. By the time the rain season arrived, Tinian no longer felt like a battlefield. Yet it did not feel like peace either. The island existed in a strange in-between state, officially secure but psychologically unstable. American forces moved freely during the day, but at night, tension returned. Campfires were kept low. Guards doubled their shifts. Veterans of earlier Pacific battles quietly admitted that Tinian felt different, less violent on the surface, more disturbing underneath. It was an island where the enemy had not been defeated so much as absorbed. Military engineers began large-scale construction almost immediately. The urgency was enormous. Tinian was not just another captured island. It was about to become one of the most important airbases in human history. Massive runways were planned, longer and wider than any before them in the Pacific. Bulldozers cut through coral, flattening fields and hills without pause. As the machines advanced, they occasionally broke into hollow spaces below. The ground would collapse suddenly, revealing dark voids beneath the surface. Work would stop. Soldiers would look down. Sometimes they saw bones, sometimes equipment, sometimes nothing at all, just darkness that seemed to have no bottom. In most cases, the order was simple: seal it and move on. The war did not allow time for mourning enemy dead, especially ones who had chosen not to be found. Engineers poured concrete into cave mouths. Steel plates were welded over openings. Entire tunnel systems were entombed beneath the foundations of runways. The logic was practical. The result was permanent. Thousands of men were now buried under future history, their final act hidden beneath the very machines that would soon change the course of the war. American intelligence tried to reconstruct what had happened in those final days. Interrogations of the few captured Japanese soldiers revealed fragments of the truth. Some spoke of last meetings where officers calmly explained that the unit would cease to exist. Others described detailed plans for cave collapses, including which explosives to use and how to block ventilation shafts. There was no panic in these stories. No chaos, only procedure. One prisoner recalled being ordered to leave his unit because he was wounded and slowing them down. He begged to stay. His officer refused. "You will live," he was told. "We will not." That soldier survived the war, but carried the weight of that sentence for the rest of his life. As construction continued, unexplained incidents persisted. American sentries reported hearing voices carried on the wind from sealed areas. Too faint to understand, too real to dismiss. Others described rhythmic tapping from underground during quiet nights. Like metal striking stone, engineers blamed thermal expansion. Officers blamed nerves. No official investigations followed. The island had a job to do, and superstition had no place in it. Yet even hardened Marines avoided certain areas after dark. The few Japanese soldiers who remained, active above ground, adapted with terrifying patience. They avoided combat unless escape was impossible. They observed American routines, learning guard rotations and supply schedules. When they struck, it was quick and silent. A sentry disappeared. A storage tent burned. A patrol returned with one less man than it left with. These acts were not attempts to win. They were statements, proof that they still existed even if the world refused to acknowledge them. Over time, these incidents became less frequent. Hunger, disease, and isolation did what bullets could not. One by one, the last holdouts died, surrendered, or vanished into places no patrol ever reached. By early 1945, Tinian was quiet, truly quiet. The island's role in the war shifted completely. Its violent past buried beneath relentless preparation for what came next. And what came next would eclipse everything. From the runways built atop those sealed caves, B-29 bombers began to take off daily. Their targets were cities. Their cargo was devastation. The men who had vanished beneath the island would never know that their final resting place had become the launch point for a new era of warfare, one that would end where they refused to survive. History books would later describe Tinian as a logistical triumph, a perfectly positioned base, a marvel of rapid military engineering. Footnotes might mention fierce resistance. Casualty numbers would be summarized in clean columns. The missing thousands would be folded into statistics, their individual choices erased in favor of totals. What was not recorded was the silence beneath the runways. What was not measured was the psychological aftermath carried by those who searched the caves, sealed the entrances, and walked away knowing they had left men alive or dead inside. Many veterans would later admit that Tinian stayed with them longer than battles, where the enemy was clearly seen and clearly destroyed. This island had asked them to fight something they could not confront directly, an enemy that chose absence as its final weapon. Long after the war, Japanese historians quietly returned to the records. Letters sent before the battle, diaries recovered from other islands, training manuals that outlined death as duty. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged. Tinian was not an anomaly. It was the purest expression of Imperial Japanese military ideology under absolute pressure. When all options were stripped away, disappearance became the final form of resistance. There were no witnesses to many of those final moments. No cameras, no reports, only stone, darkness, and obedience. Even today, parts of Tinian remain unexplored. Modern maps mark certain areas as unstable ground. Construction crews are warned but rarely told why. Locals speak of places where the earth sounds hollow when walked upon. The island functions, breathes, lives, but never entirely forgets. Because beneath it lies an army that did not retreat, did not surrender, and did not leave. They simply stopped existing where history could see them. As the war moved forward, Tinian slipped out of public attention, but within military circles, it became something else entirely, a place spoken about in lowered voices. New units rotated onto the island, men who had not fought the original battle and did not know its details. They were told the island was secure, cleared, safe. Yet veterans who remained offered quiet warnings. Do not wander alone at night. Do not approach sealed caves. Do not assume silence means emptiness. These were not orders written on paper. They were lessons learned the hard way. American military police logs from late 1944 record incidents that were officially classified as minor or unexplained. A guard found dead near a fuel depot with no gunshot wound. A mess tent sabotaged from the inside. A radio wire cut cleanly, deliberately, by someone who understood its function. Each event was investigated briefly, then dismissed. The conclusion was always the same: isolated enemy stragglers. The deeper implication that some Japanese soldiers were still operating. Months after total defeat was considered inconvenient, even embarrassing. The truth was more complex. These remaining soldiers were no longer part of an army. They had no command structure, no supply chain, no hope of victory. What they did have was time. Time to observe, time to endure, time to decide when and how to die. Many had sworn personal oaths not to be taken alive, not to be recorded as prisoners, not to allow the enemy the satisfaction of closure. To them, survival itself was a temporary condition, not a goal. One captured diary, found near a collapsed tunnel, contained a single repeated sentence written dozens of times in careful handwriting. I am already dead. The pages that followed were blank. Psychologists studying the Pacific War would later identify Tinian as a turning point, not in tactics, but in understanding the mental extremes of total war. The disappearance of nearly 9,000 soldiers was not simply the result of suicide or entrapment. It was the consequence of an ideology that demanded absolute obedience even after command ceased to exist. These men were not waiting for orders anymore. They had become the order. As the B-29 operations intensified, the irony of Tinian grew heavier. The island that swallowed an army now powered a force that would shatter cities. Every takeoff thundered over sealed graves. Every landing rolled across ground hollowed by tunnels and bones. Few aircrew knew what lay beneath them. Those who did rarely spoke of it. Occasionally, construction teams unearthed personal items: a rusted helmet, a canteen, a notebook fused shut by heat and moisture. These artifacts were collected, tagged, and shipped off for analysis or storage. They were treated as objects, not remnants of vanished lives. The war demanded efficiency, not reflection. By early 1945, Japanese radio broadcasts began to weaken. Rumors of impending defeat spread even among the most isolated holdouts. Some soldiers on Tinian reportedly heard distant aircraft engines and assumed Japan was launching a counteroffensive. Others believed the increased bombing meant the homeland was under attack and that surrender would never come. For many, these interpretations no longer mattered. Their fate had been decided months earlier, underground, in darkness. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the announcement echoed across the Pacific. On Tinian, there was no celebration, no shock, only a quiet acknowledgement that the war had ended somewhere else. Patrols were sent out one last time to search for survivors. Loudspeakers again broadcast messages in Japanese, this time announcing surrender as fact, not persuasion. A few men emerged, thin, broken, blinking at the sun like creatures from another world. Most did not. Some were found dead weeks later, having chosen death after hearing the announcement rather than accepting its truth. Others were never found at all. Post-war surveys attempted to finalize casualty numbers. Official Japanese records listed units that had ceased to exist on Tinian, a phrase deliberately vague. American reports continued to list the missing as killed in action. Between those two bureaucratic answers lay a reality no document could fully capture. An army had not simply been destroyed. It had dissolved, physically, psychologically, historically. In later decades, as veterans aged and spoke more freely, fragments of the story surfaced. Marines recalled sealing caves while hearing movement inside. Engineers remembered being ordered not to ask questions. Japanese survivors spoke of comrades who volunteered to stay behind and close the door from within. Each account added weight to a truth that had long been avoided. Tinian was not just a battlefield. It was a deliberate disappearance. Even today, archaeologists approach the island with caution. Ground-penetrating radar reveals anomalies, voids beneath the surface that match no natural formations. Some are investigated. Many are left alone. There is an unspoken understanding that not every grave needs to be opened. Not every answer needs to be dragged into the light. Because what happened on Tinian was not meant to be seen. It was meant to end quietly, underground. With no witnesses, an army choosing to vanish rather than be remembered as defeated. And that choice still shapes the island, long after the guns fell silent. When the war officially ended, history moved forward with speed and certainty, but Tinian did not. The island remained suspended in something unresolved, carrying a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. Victory speeches were delivered elsewhere. Surrender documents were signed far away. Here there were only sealed caves, abandoned tunnels, and an uncounted dead who had chosen not to leave behind witnesses. The world recorded the end of World War II as a moment in time. But on Tinian the ending had already happened, quietly, underground, without permission from history itself. The disappearance of nearly 9,000 Japanese soldiers was never meant to be understood. It was designed to deny explanation. No final charge, no surrender line, no mass grave that could be photographed and summarized. Instead, there was absence, and absence is difficult to archive. Governments prefer numbers. Textbooks prefer conclusions. Tinian offered neither. It offered only a question that refused to close. What happens when an army decides that existing is no longer acceptable? Beneath the modern island, beneath roads, airstrips, and tourist paths, the caves remain. Some are mapped, many are not. They are sealed not just by stone, but by choice. Each one represents a final decision made in darkness by men who believed that being forgotten was better than being captured, that erasing themselves was the last form of loyalty they could offer. They did not disappear by accident. They vanished with purpose. This is why the story of Tinian is rarely told in full. It is uncomfortable. It does not fit neatly into narratives of heroism or victory. It forces us to confront a reality where ideology outlived command, where obedience outlasted survival, where the battlefield extended beyond life itself. It reminds us that war does not always end when the fighting stops. Sometimes it ends when people decide not to be found. Today, visitors walk across Tinian without knowing what lies beneath their feet. The island looks peaceful. The sky is clear. The ground is solid. But history is not always visible on the surface. Sometimes it hides, sealed away, waiting not to be discovered, but to be remembered. Because the most brutal secret of Tinian is not how those soldiers died. It is how completely they succeeded in disappearing. History tells us how wars begin, and history records who wins them. But it rarely speaks about those who choose to vanish rather than be counted. On Tinian, nearly 9,000 men did not surrender. They did not retreat. They did not leave behind a final battle for the world to remember. They erased themselves. Beneath the runways that changed the course of human history, beneath the calm surface of a quiet island, their story remains sealed in stone and silence. No monuments mark their end. No victory parades acknowledge their choice. Only caves, collapsed tunnels, and unanswered questions remain. Tinian reminds us that war does not always end with peace. Sometimes it ends with disappearance. Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is refusing to exist in defeat. And even today, as the world moves on, the island still holds its secret. An army that was never fully found, never fully counted, and never truly gone. Because the most terrifying thing a war can leave behind is not destruction, it is silence. Thanks for watching.